Well, good afternoon and welcome to this occasion, this valedictory lecture of Simon Szreter. Those of you who are more eagle-eyed might realise that I'm not as billed Mary Lavin. Mary, unfortunately, has COVID. And that, of course, sadly, gives me a reason to plug the book by Hilary and Simon, After COVID. In which they make an impassioned plea for a return to what I think they call collectivist individualism. And that is, I suppose, part of one of Simon's great achievements in his post here in Cambridge, linking history with public policy. I'm sure he'll be telling us more about that. I was told very strictly by Simon not to deliver a long eulogy about his career, his achievements, which we have heard about this afternoon, this morning, at a conference. We've heard about his intellectual achievements, his mentoring of many people who are here in the audience. So he's had an immense impact, and we'll know more about that when he speaks to us. Simon, apart from being a supporter of the Baggies, I think they're called, is otherwise a great supporter of the University of Cambridge. He came here as a student, I think, at Pembroke in 1976. I remember when I arrived in 1997 talking to his Director of Studies, Clive Bilcock, who said, Simon, he said, I remember him arriving. He was like a lovable Labrador puppy. Well, I'm afraid I've always thought of Simon as that, but during today, we've heard that he's still, in a sense, like that. The phrases which have come out as being enthusiastic, ebullient, collaborative, making everybody work together. So Simon arrived as an undergraduate. He was appointed in what I think is now a sort of almost historic thing, a new blood lecturer. Does anybody remember those? Well, as an assistant lecturer. Does anybody remember that? And in 2010, he was promoted to the chair of history and public policy, the only one, I think, in the United Kingdom. He's now moving to the next, and I, speaking personally, the best stage of one's academic career is called the longest sabbatical you've ever had, when you will, I'm sure, be producing many more excellent books, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us about your career to date. Simon.
Well, thanks everybody. That's pretty amazing. Just to show you how up in the world I am, I'm going to take a photo of you all. Right. So smile. Right. Not just a historian, you know. Well, how extraordinary this is to be giving a lecture to such a large room of people, almost all of whom I know. But do you all know me? Let's find out. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask your indulgence on one small point. As I'm giving this lecture because I've reached 67 years, I will be entertaining you, hopefully, for fully 1 minute for each year. It's okay. Think of it less like a lecture, more like a feature movie. The movie of my life. First, then, to my title, Born into the Turbulent Flow of History. This speaks to the question, why did I become a historian? Well, how could I not have been provoked to ask from early childhood onwards, who am I? Where am I? How is it that I find myself trying to learn to swim in this particular fast-flowing river of the late 1950s and early 1960s, first in Hull in Yorkshire, where I was born, and then as a child in Birmingham. With its extraordinary, compulsive and rebellious soundtrack of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan and so many others. Yes, that twist and shout my brother and sister will recognise is the well-worn one of our own. Plus growing up in the streets of Handsworth, intrigued by all the peoples, languages, foods, clothes and sounds from all over the world that I encountered. And then there were the excitements of the small screen. There I was, growing up in a family household with my younger sister and brother, Luby Lou and Teddy. Oh, sorry, Anya and Adam. Here they are. Me on the left, Adam in the middle, who's now enormous, and Anya on the right. But it was at home every day where the greatest dramas occurred in our young lives. Volcanic eruptions were a daily experience from the Jekyll and Hyde Holocaust survivor who was our father. Undoubtedly had PSTD, as it would now be diagnosed. It was around the time of our first family visit to Poland in 1970, age 13, when, after a conventional childhood of daily Christian services and hymns in my primary school, I recall asking my mother, "Surely I must be half Jewish." She confirmed that by blood that was true. But then, of course, according to Jewish law, with a Gentile mother, I was not. My independent-minded but also warm and loving mother, Dulcie, was the countervailing, resilient anchor for the family's emotional stability. She was the seventh in a family of 9, born in 1925 into Depression-era Dowlais in South Wales. Her mother, Gladys May, had eschewed her early ambition to be a missionary to marry my grandfather, William John Smith, a recently bereaved widower with 3 small children. Will himself was an illegitimate child, born in 1884, whose mother treated him badly and who had he'd left home at age 13 after various temporary farming jobs and other activities in South Wales, in Monmouthshire, along the way, including bare-knuckle prize-fighting boxing, which he was apparently damn good at. He got himself a job in the Great Western Railway, the GWR. On a shelf in a station, he came across Charles Monroe Sheldon's book, In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do? He became a Christian. He then became an articulate and self-taught learned Methodist lay preacher and a Labour Party trade unionist, prevented from taking up the offer of a safe parliamentary seat in South Wales due to his large and growing family. He said it just couldn't work for him. For Anya, Adam and me, he was a benevolent, playful Methuselah figure from whom my brother learned to love cricket over many hours spent on the sofa with Grandpa. For my part, I prized his wise and open answers to my troubled questions about religions and good and evil in the world, which I felt I could put to him. When we knew him, he had long ago transferred his job in the GWR from South Wales to become a foreman of the goods yard in idyllic Barnstaple in North Devon. This was where my mother grew up with all her 8 sisters and brothers. In the 1960s, on our family beach-bound summer holidays, we would meet up with all these Smith family cousins, uncles and aunts, and build our happy memories with these 30 or so cousins in our generation, and there are now probably 50 in the generation below, several of whom are here today, including the Smith family's historian, Jan Botel, who has transcribed many of Grandpa Will's scores of wise and learned sermons. Great labour of love and very interesting. We've also got so many Smiths There's even one of them who is another professor here in Cambridge, Jonathan Mant, Professor of GP Medicine. And we've got the next door neighbour of Sir George Godber. Now, why did I say that? You'll find out later. We all greedily ate up Granny's endless supply of Welsh cakes and basked in her equally warm hospitality. This had extended during the war to taking in many homeless travellers arriving at the nearby railway station and directed on to the large family house, Winsome in Victoria Road, by her husband, Will. So her youngest daughter, my mother Dulcie, was simply following the role model of her mother, taking in another wartime waif and stray when she met my father at Exeter University. My father was an only child who, by March 1942, had buried both his parents in the Warsaw Ghetto. Aged 14, a bit like Dulcie's father, he then had to find his own way, but of course in an even more hostile environment. Apart from guile and good luck, part of the reason for his miraculous survival in occupied Warsaw was his fair complexion and blue eyes. He was given false identity papers and at times a hiding place by an unbelievably courageous Catholic couple, Adam and Maria Świąda. They risked their own and their 4 young children's lives in saving a number of Jews for which they are recognized at Yad Vashem. So, having weaved and dodged his way through Nazi-occupied Warsaw, on his 17th birthday on August 2nd, 1944, he enlisted in Chrobry 2 battalion as Rifleman Kot, the Cat, his nom de guerre, and he joined the Warsaw Uprising. 6 weeks later, defending a hard-pressed point on the front line, he received the almost mortal wound which incapacitated his right arm and left him with a spinal injury and multiple waves of nerve root pain every day for the rest of his life. Hence the somewhat traumatizing daily domestic volcanic eruptions when we were growing up. Not long on patience. But he was able to keep this from all those he worked with, and he could also be enormous fun. He was full of knowledge and wisdom and very stimulating, with a passion for athletics and football. He took me to watch West Bromwich Albion regularly from age 7, and in 1966 he took me to Wembley to see England win the World Cup. Yep, I was there. And Roy Lowe over here is also a Baggies fan and was a colleague of my father's for many, many years, and I'm so glad he can be here today. And later, we went together to the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972, where he showed me how to dodge the German authorities and get into some athletics sessions we didn't have tickets for. And of course, yet again, reverberating tragedy struck Jews there in Germany. When I was a teenager, the family spent 3 long summer holidays in 1970, 72 and 74 in Iron Curtain, Poland. This taught me plenty about the black market, the value of Levi jeans in particular, but also about the nature of free thought. I observed that we enjoyed this in a rather taken for granted way in Britain, whereas it was only behind closed doors in the apartments of my father's family, my father's Polish friends from before the war and during the uprising, that highly critical discussions were keenest, most heartfelt and vigorous. It showed me also how challenging it was for our friends and for a whole nation living under an Orwellian regime imposed by the same Soviet state that had sold them down the river with the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. It's often forgotten that Hitler wasn't the only one who started World War II. It was also Stalin. And of course, the turbulent past keeps resurfacing in the flow of time. Once again, a Russian dictator threatens the precious freedom of East European peoples. Once again, the Jewish people are embroiled with another people in a tragic episode, with the last one still so raw in living memory. So, how could I not be fascinated by history, with such evidence of its emotional and wider social and political importance before my eyes in my own family, as I travelled abroad, and indeed daily across Birmingham, from highly cultural Handsworth, the European capital of Jamaica, according to Benjamin Zephaniah. That's Handsworth Park. Our road went down to Handsworth Park. To King Edward's Direct Grant Secondary School in leafy, affluent Edgbaston, right next to the university, where my father lectured in the new education school and met his good friend Roy Lowe. Meanwhile, near home at Handsworth Secondary Modern Girls' School, my mother pioneered sixth form A-level English teaching for those who had failed the 11 plus, many of them from families recently arrived in the UK. She was a stalwart of the local Labour Party and of the successful 1990s Save Handsworth Park campaign, which elicited £7 million from the National Lottery Fund. Her contribution, this was because of all the cuts of the 80s. Her contribution included the innovation of Classroom in the Park for local schools to come in and own this precious community asset. So, what is history? Well, its subject matter is limitless, and the ways of studying history are endless. It's very telling, and it reflects an important truth, that both the object and the subject have exactly the same name. History, we commonly understand, is everything that happened in the past. But history is also the study of all that is past. The fact that they are indeed one and the same thing epistemologically lies behind the conviction that has animated my career. This is the view that fully trained, rational and sceptical historians skilled in weighing evidence of all different kinds must, as a civic duty, engage with public policy as well as with education in the broad sense. When historians do rigorous, original research, we bring back to our present something new, something different that was not previously known. It wouldn't have been research otherwise. This is, epistemologically equivalent to science, archaeology, whatever. Historians bring back new stuff that we didn't know before. This new knowledge about the past crucially has the capacity to change, not merely to buttress, a contemporary agenda. It can change our collective understandings of who we are and of what we are trying to do. That was the reason why in 2002 I co-founded History and Policy with Alistair Reid, who is here today, Pat Thane, who sadly could not come, she's got an illness, and Virginia Berridge, who is at the London School of Hygiene. And you see the three of them on the bottom line there, along with Andrew Blick, who became a director of the History and Policy for a while. It's now, since 2021, in the very capable hands of Philip Murphy, at the top left, at the Institute of Historical Research. With the initial support here in Cambridge of Barry Supple, Martin Daunton, David Reynolds, and at the IHR of David Cannadine, and with the dozen or more other colleagues you see here on our advisory board, along with literally hundreds of historians who have contributed in many different ways, it has flourished over the last 22 years. There are now over 550 publications on the website, which I and Alistair have edited. It has become an internationally recognised resource, and helping to ensure that historians and their research get a hearing in the public policy world. As an example of its work, in 2011, I was invited by the Cabinet Office Strategy Unit to convene a couple of sessions for historians to inform its work on David Cameron's new Big Society agenda of voluntary civic activism. Remember that? In one of the two fastest book publications schedules I've ever been involved in, a highly critical volume of papers appeared just a year later, reflecting what we had said in these two sessions. The Big Society debate. Despite such speed, by the time the book was published, the term Big Society had vanished from the government's lexicon. I have always wondered what effect our critical presentations in Whitehall in 2010 might have had. It's very hard, of course, to prove a negative. 2010 was also the time of my own involvement in some direct action with the students, a different kind of big society engagement to that envisaged by Mr. Cameron. This was when the Liberal Democrats, under the shameless Nick Clegg, now of Facebook, defected on their manifesto pledge allowing the coalition government to triple student fees at a stroke. There was a 10-day occupation of this university's senior combination room next to King's College Chapel, and I often, you see on the right, you see all the students inside the combination room doing very productive things, actually, a lot of studying going on. I often joined the students in my gown. They asked me to come in my gown. They wanted to have support shown. And I spent several evenings at the defended entrance, which you see in the middle at the bottom there, negotiating with the county fire officer, persuading him not to declare the occupation a fire hazard. I ended up on first name terms with him. On December the 9th, the coldest night in the year, with thousands of students and sixth formers as well, we decamped down to London to join the great final protest march against the vote in Parliament. And if somebody there on the left looks a little familiar to some of you, that's because he is. Hubertus Jahn and I both joined the march. And Richard Drayton was also there, I remember, with his gown on in Parliament Square. Before and after the vote, we were kettled for hours by the Met in Parliament Square, before eventually being packed tight onto Westminster Bridge, extremely dangerous with its low parapets. Finally, they dispersed us one by one onto the South Bank, photographing each of us as we left. Hubertus and I both had protest letters subsequently published in the LRB, and kettling was ruled illegal by the High Court in April 2011. So, that was a period of direct action. Coming back to the roots of my own early desire to undertake historical research to shed light on public policy concerns, in 1975, as a sixth former, I was delighted to find that Cambridge's history faculty seemed to offer a course that combined history with sociology, politics, and economics when you looked at what papers were being taught. I had read Peter Laslett's fascinating The World We Have Lost, and so was aware also that the history of the family and population was being pioneered by the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure. I applied to Pembroke College because by enterprise and good fortune on a reconnoitring visit to Cambridge to choose a college, I had briefly met a genuine, fully paid up economic historian in the fellowship there and had heard what a good teacher he was. This was Clive Trebilcoe, who sadly died rather young. Clive subsequently provided me with a model for conscientious supervising of students. Furthermore, his third-year paper, getting us students to write testing comparative essays on the economic development of Germany, Russia, and Japan, gave me the confidence 2 decades later to do something similar with the generous help of over a dozen colleagues. This was the paper, Part 2 paper, World Population Development and Environment since 1750. All the students taking this paper rose extremely well to its challenges, which required them to write comparative essays on Britain, China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa, including, after they'd studied it, in a 3-hour exam. So, returning to my own undergraduate start in Cambridge in 1976, I was stimulated by attending as many lectures as my late-night social life would permit. Jonathan Riley Smith and Clive Trebilcoe were the only ones who could get me to their 9 o'clockers. Jonathan on the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders was pure Monty Python, and your ribs were aching by the end of the lecture. While at the end of Clive's lectures, it was your writing wrist that would be aching from the rapid-fire delivery, something akin to the machine guns of the Vickers Company, whose history Clive had just published in 1977. The reading for my supervised weekly essays in my first 2 years enabled me to at last study subjects such as the Vikings and the papacy, to debate slavery in the USA with Mark Kaplanoff till late in the evening, to learn about the causes of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the political thought of Bentham and Karl Marx. In my final year, I was able to study the problems of comparative economic development with Clive, and also of comparative demographic history, along with the riveting history of revolution in Buganda in the late 19th century on John Iliff's fascinating special paper. So fascinating did I find these subjects that they led to two quite different adventures. The first in 1979, immediately after graduating, and the second in 1981, which nearly ended that curiosity rather abruptly at age 24 in Kampala. Before university, I had travelled independently, hitchhiking and greyhound busing my way all around the USA for several months in 1976. In that bicentennial year, a Union Jack on my rucksack got me plenty of fun and plenty of rides, including one in a small private plane, where I found myself handed the controls by its heavily relaxed young Californian owners. So when in my third year at university, I heard that there were surviving 18th century Spanish colonial parish registers in the Peruvian Andes, I thought, what can be better than that? I decided to apply for endorsement from the Cambridge University Explorers and Travellers Club to mount a research expedition. Getting the funding proved exciting in itself, as this was a trip to darkest Peru. The makers of Paddington Bear donated one to us. I must admit, initially I thought, what the hell use is this? Then we thought, raffle it. And we made £200. That was actually a third of what we needed back in those days. Peter Laslett, an ex-serviceman, wrote a letter to the RAF informing them with the right degree of pomposity that our trip was to carry out absolutely essential research. Somebody in the RAF was kind enough to smile on that one. So the RAF flew us to and from Washington, D.C. Then all we had to do was simple. Hitchhike the 1,000 miles straight down I-95 to get to Miami, where Aero Peru had given us a 50% off flight to Lima and back. Our 2 months in Peru included, of course, visits to the famous sites in the south. But before we could get down to Cuzco and Machu Picchu, we completed 4 weeks hard labor in the north, in the archive of the Bishop's Palace in Cajamarca, using records for the years 1743 to 1821 from the southernmost parish of the diocese, San Nicolas de Tolentino of Cajabamba. We were able to record such detail as illegitimacy rates and the Spanish racial classification and the extent of interracial marriage. At the end of our work, we decided to visit the parish itself, down in the south of the diocese. When we got there, striding down the steps to meet us in cowboy boots and jeans was none other than the current parish priest of San Nicolas, Father Miguel Garnett. Miguel was in fact an Englishman. He'd started working in the slums in Lima from 1967, and since 1972, he'd been working among the villagers of the High Sierra in the north of Peru. He was the co-author of Vamos Caminando, a liberation theology catechism for the campesinos. We were in his company for less than 24 hours, but became friends for life, regularly corresponding despite the unreliable Peruvian postal system, especially during the decade of the Sendero Luminoso terror, which Miguel lived through and described in his great novel, Tempest in the Andes, available on Amazon, I believe. It's a good read. Now, it's much easier. Starting in lockdown, we talk every week on Zoom. Like many people, our habits were transformed. The second adventure, 2 years later, was the result of fascination with the history of Buganda, the historic centre of modern-day Uganda, after taking John Iliff's paper. We were visiting our great friend, Jonathan Carr, who's here, who was a young headmaster in Kakamega, a town on Kenya's western border with Uganda. On that trip, we also visited Charlie Forbes Abden and Rosalind, who are also here. I had a yearning to go across the border to Kampala, so near to Kakamega, to see Kasubi, the site on the left there. Kasubi, the site of the palace and tombs of the Kabakas, the kings of the Baganda, as well as Namirembe in the middle, the Anglican cathedral, and the grave of Alexander Mackay on the right, an extraordinary missionary figure we had studied. We were so close. But Uganda was in a fragile state, with the Tanzanian army in control since it pushed out Idi Amin in 1979. We knew it was risky. Jonathan, to his credit, strongly advised against. So we visited the Ugandan High Commissioner in Kenya, who assured us Kampala was fine, trade relations were fine, there were many other Europeans there. None of this turned out to be true. In retrospect, I think the most significant thing was the High Commissioner was probably about 20 years old. We did, however, meet a Kenyan businesswoman on the train to the border, and she told us there was a safe hotel on a central market square where other Kenyan traders stayed. Crossing the border was hair-raising at the Uganda checkpoint. A gun-toting 15-year-old toyed with our passports, smiling at me, suggesting they weren't real, clearly after some baksheesh. And there were several more such checkpoints in our ramshackle taxi as we went the 150 miles to Kampala, which also had, I think, at least one blowout and possibly two on the way. It was in an absolute state. Once there, we registered at the hotel, and with just an hour of daylight left, we walked out into the streets to discover 2-story high mountains of uncollected refuse rotting in the sun on every corner. Things were close to anarchy. We saw only 2 Europeans, nuns, darting back into their sanctuary. But the Baganda were proud, dignified people, just as I expected from what I had learned, and we attracted no gawping stares, even though we were clearly out of place. But then things took a turn for the worse. At 3 in the morning, there was banging on our bedroom door, which I opened to be confronted by a Tanzanian soldier pointing his submachine gun at me and ordering us out. I asked him what was going on. He said, "You are the doctor. We know all about you." That was distinctly worrying. I had signed the hotel register as a doctoral student at Cambridge University. I persuaded him to allow us to shut the door while my female travelling companion got dressed. I realised with some concern that if he thought I was some kind of spy or hostile agent, he had all the evidence he needed. In the tiny hand sack, which was all that we'd brought with us, there was a water bottle, a map of Kampala, a brand new Pentax mini camera the size of a large matchbox, looking just like the kind of thing a spy would have, a waterproof, an apple, oh yes, and a bladed knife for self-defense. So what to do? I decided to open the bag out, leaving it casually open on the floor with the waterproof spilling out, the map and the apple showing on top, and leaving the knife and the camera under the waterproof, and hoping they just thought it looked empty and abandoned in our hurry to leave the room. We were taken down a floor and put in a line against the wall with 6 other Kenyan inmates of the hotel. This began to uncomfortably remind me of scenes in World War II films. I think you know the sort I mean. I decided I must do something. I persistently asked what they were doing with us. I was told they would be taking me, not my companion, to the police station. I was very clear in my mind that I did not want to go to the police station. The mention of the police gave me an idea, however. These were Tanzanian soldiers. I insisted I wanted to speak to the police officer in charge before I would consent to go to the station. I could see these were just Tanzanian boys carrying out orders. I knew from what I'd learned from John Iliff's paper that the Baganda, the dominant ethnic group in Kampala, were extremely well educated and proud of their country and their history. My thought was that if I could speak to the commanding police officer, I could persuade him that I was in Kampala because of my academic interest in Buganda's history, not as some kind of fifth columnist. Luckily for me, a captain in the police was found who spoke decent English. I gave him my story. I could see he was at least interested, but skeptical. It was a crazy story because it was a crazy thing to have done. So, my last throw of the dice to avoid the police station was the Kabakas. I knew that all Buganda were intensely proud of their long line of Kabakas going back more or less to 1066 in a different place. They're buried at Kabusi. Provided this man was a Buganda, this might work. I remember saying to him as calmly as I could, I can prove to you that I love your country's history like you do. He looked surprised by such a claim. I said, I can tell you the names of all your Kabakas from the beginning. It was something I had idly learned when revising for finals 2 summers before. There's quite a lot of them. I couldn't remember them all, but with the assistance of adrenaline and fear, I made a good start with Kintu, Chwa, Kimera, and Tembu, moving on through to Mulando, Jemba, Suna, Semakamania, and finally arriving in the late 19th century after Junju, Semakokiro, Kamanya, Suna II, with Muteza and Mwanga II. I clearly remember at Mwanga's name, a smile broke out on my interlocutor's face. Best smile I've seen. He told me that while he believed I was genuine, he also thought I was mad. He ordered that we should go back to our room and at daybreak, as soon as the night curfew ended, get a ride back to Kenya. We were told the next morning by the distressed businesswoman we had travelled with on the way over, who had been staying separately with friends, that by a peculiar piece of bad luck, the day we had chosen for our visit to Kampala was the Tanzanian authorities had decided to have an unannounced and unprecedented crackdown on Kenyans in Kampala, and that 6 people had died in the police station that night, some of her friends. So we never got to see all the wonderful sights of Kampala, but we did live to tell the tale. 27 years later, I was invited to speak at a World Bank and DFID conference in nearby Entebbe on social protection for the poorest poor in Africa, and I was finally able to see what you've seen on the previous slide. This invitation followed articles I published in 2007 in the journal World Development and in The Lancet, arguing that England's history back to the Tudors demonstrated the importance of creating universal social security and identity registration systems to encourage economic development. These same articles also earned me a trip back to Peru in 2011 through an invitation to present to the seminar run by Hernando de Soto, author of The Mystery of Capital. De Soto, this was all the rage for a while, De Soto had argued that poor people around the world could not turn their assets into capital because they lacked legal systems to register their property rights. My argument was that De Soto's registration recommendation was incomplete without a secure and safe system also to register from birth the identities of all persons. As I showed, this was something which had distinguished English society and economy since 1538. And when Thomas Cromwell, at the top in the middle there, introduced the system of parish registration. Apparently, my article was also picked up in India, a place along with much of sub-Saharan Africa, where, as you can see by the dark blue on this map, over 40% of the populace remained unregistered by age 5. This article was extensively cited by Nandan Nilekani to help justify his ambitious Aadhaar digital ID system for all Indians, which of course has not been without its controversies. My interest in identity registration systems also led to a fruitful meeting and close friendship with Keith Breckenridge. Unknown to me, he's one of the principal organisers of this whole day here. Unknown to me, Keith had been researching the precocious South African fingerprint identity system. We discovered each other when Keith hosted me in 2006 when I delivered the St. John's College Bishop Colenso lecture in Pietermaritzburg in KwaZulu-Natal, seat of this great maverick bishopric. Keith and I agreed that we knew of almost no other scholars doing this kind of work, so we convened a British Academy-funded conference here in St. John's in 2010. This was an exciting event that attracted an extraordinary galaxy of leading international scholars eager to contribute to this important new subject. It resulted in the volume Registration and Recognition, with its cover disporting a Ming dynasty hukou, a household register from 14th century China, to get across the clear message of the volume that identity registration was not a modernist European invention, but has been a primordial state institution for thousands of years in world history. To return now 30 years earlier to the start of my academic voyages, my doctoral research in demographic history was inspired by the revolutionary findings of the Cambridge Group for the History of Population. The group was led by the great scholars you see here from left to right: Peter Laslett, Tony Wrigley, Roger Schofield, and Richard Smith, who I'm so glad has been able to join us today and is here with us and gave a lovely short address earlier to the colloquium earlier. As a final year undergraduate, it was Richard Smith who gently encouraged me to think of a PhD. Always very important to get that little nudge from someone you respect. In the post-war decades, the theory of demographic transition had ruled the roost in the social sciences. This was an elegant general historical model which claimed to explain how economic growth caused populations to grow. All traditional pre-industrial societies, according to this social science theory, had stationary populations, which you see on the left at the bottom of the graph, in the grey, stationary population. Their high birth rates were cancelled out by high death rates, as you see in stage 1 at the top of the graph. With economic growth came higher living standards and medical advances, and so mortality rates fell. This produced the transitional phases of stage 2 and 3 in the graph, resulting in rapid population growth, because that's the grey whale-like figure rising, because high fertility rates, continuing to be sanctioned by traditional religions, continued for a generation or two before societies began to adjust to the better child survival and fewer births resulting from mortality falling. And that eventually in stage 4, when they did adjust, resulted once again in a stationary population, this time with low birth rates and low death rates. Britain had been the first nation to go through industrialisation, and so according to the theory was the first to experience this rapid population growth already in the late 18th century, then followed in the 19th century by European and American populations. Post-war economic planners in the West dared to believe that this could also be reverse engineered, that the world's poorer countries could jump faster into economic growth by bringing down their fertility rates more quickly through proactive birth control policies, which would improve per capita living standards and rates of investment. I was pretty suspicious of this demographic transition theory. It bore the strong resemblance to a Whig view of history, or something, a Whig view of history, something that depicted history as a single process inexorably leading to a morally validated present. I was concerned that jumping into development work, which was something I was considering as a career, could have questionable intellectual assumptions. And in fact, an article I published in 1993 in the US journal Population and Development Review showed that it was Cold War fears after China followed Russia into communism in 1949, which had actually stimulated US social scientists to propose the reverse engineering to help sell the promise, sell their own discipline and the promise of Western-style economic growth to the world's many poor countries. But was the demographic transition in its original form even historically correct? The Cambridge Group findings, published in 1981 as the Population History of England, 1541 to 1871, a massive tome, absolutely drove a coach and horses through this neat model as far as the demographic history of England was concerned, which was pretty problematic, but since it was supposedly England's history that had been used to justify the model back in 1945. As you can see in the figures above the graph at the top, population growth of England was massive between 1750 and 1850, an unprecedented tripling from 5.9 to 16.7 million. Was this due to death rates falling, as demographic transition theory claimed? Hardly at all. The dotted line at the bottom of this graph is the best measure there is of mortality change over time, and it shows there was no trend rise in the expectation of life at birth until after 1870. The biggest cause of the massive growth in population was actually a massive rise in fertility. That's the thick black line. That wasn't supposed to happen according to demographic transition theory. Fertility is already supposedly at a maximum. How can it go up? Far from birth rates having been high before industrialisation, the Cambridge Group found quite moderate fertility. And perhaps the biggest surprise of all, Peter Laslett found the small nuclear family household, supposedly characteristic only of modern societies, was generally prevalent in 16th and 17th century England. Most people in Shakespeare's day did not marry and start having children until their mid-20s, and about a fifth of both sexes never married. And the illegitimacy rate was remarkably low. The main reason population grew after 1750 was that people married earlier and in greater numbers because of the proliferation of jobs and the security against unemployment provided by a pre-existing social security system, the Elizabethan Poor Law. What I was interested in for my PhD was the next phase of fertility history, that dramatic subsequent plunge in the black line, with births falling from a peak of 6 per woman in the 1810s to under 2 by the late 1930s. This rapid reduction in fertility had occurred without any government birth control policies, if anything, quite the opposite. Luckily for me, at the 1911 census, the government of the day had sanctioned a unique 100% survey of the fertility of all married couples. But at the start of my research, I discovered something very curious about the way in which the results of that census were reported. This was the Registrar General's official model of social classes. It presented, guess what, a linear story, in this case of progress in the 5 or 6 social gradings, with birth control supposedly starting with the exclusive upper middle class and professions, then trickling down to the lower middle class, from them to the skilled working class, then via the partly skilled to the lowly unskilled working class, the last to catch on. I had, of course, been acutely aware of the salience of social class in British society, partly from growing up in it since the late 1950s, and also since reading E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class while at school. As an undergraduate, I had the good fortune of attending the many lively and relevant lectures from Gareth Stedman Jones, Vic Gattrell, David Ganadine, Boyd Hilton, Peter Clark, and others. Now, as a PhD student, a course of 8 lectures on social class, embracing Gramsci and much else, given by the young Dr. Alistair Reid, my future co-founder of History and Policy, confirmed me further in my suspicion that the Registrar General's model, like the demographic transition model, was far too neat and potentially misleading. I became even more concerned about it when I realised that pretty much the same linear model of so-called class, first invented for the 1911 census, was in fact still very much in use at the most recent UK census of 1981. Indeed, it was to be found ubiquitously in epidemiological and sociological studies throughout the 20th century, including the then new and influential Black Report of 1980 on health inequalities. It seemed to me that I'd stumbled on something extremely odd, a widely used social class scheme that was quite alien from the much more sophisticated accounts by historians and sociologists of social class relations in modern British society. What was even worse, it could be something actually impeding more probing inquiry about change. Fully the first half of my PhD was devoted to unearthing how this official model came into existence. It emerged from a critical debate before World War I between public health environmentalists and hereditarian eugenicists. I knew my findings on the questionable provenance of this influential model should be published immediately, and that it was social and public policy scientists, not actually historians, who needed to hear about this. So I submitted it, and it was published in December 1984 in the British Journal of Sociology, where it's the third article in the issue. Every academic will tell you their first research publication in a proper peer-reviewed journal holds a special place for them, and that's mine. I received a note from Peter Laslett on the 6th of February 1985 telling me that the Registrar General himself had told him over the phone that he had read it and that it had made a considerable impression inside the Office of Population Census and Survey. So my senior academic career began with the message that if you do original and rigorous historical research and then bring it to the attention of the public policy world, it can be taken seriously. After completing my PhD, I worked for a year as a research assistant for Michael Young, Lord Young of Dartington, co-author of the 1945 Labour Manifesto, founder of the Consumers Association, the Open University, and so many other institutions. He was tireless, 7 to 11, 3, 6, 5, yes, including Christmas Day as far as I could see. It was an interesting taste of a world close to politics. Indeed, I was so close that I recall realizing one day that the small Yoda-like figure approaching me in the corridor of the House of Lords, somehow emanating charisma, was in fact an elderly Harold Wilson. Of several projects I worked on for Michael Young, probably the most useful was the number crunching I did to enable his brand new venture, the College of Health, to publish booklets of differences in NHS waiting times all around the country. I accompanied him to the Department of Health and Social Security, where in the days before FOI requests, he persuaded officials to release routine administrative data they collected on patient waiting lists in the 8 major medical specialisms from all around the country. Here you can see my handwritten notes from a meeting at the DHSS. I think the only time I've ended up on national TV in this country was when the first booklet came out in May 1984. Michael Young was very astute in seeing that rising waiting times were a politically sensitive consequence of Mrs. Thatcher's tax-saving cuts to public services, which could be exposed using the DHS's own data. This experience encouraged me over a decade later in July 1998 to take up an invitation from Andrew Adonis, Tony Blair's education special advisor, to come to 10 Downing Street to discuss a piece I'd published in the New Statesman in October 1997, pointing out the consequences of the extraordinary 10% cut to the number of teachers in state schools under Mrs. Thatcher. Yes, fully 50,000 teaching posts went to help fund the tax cuts. It was the first time the state had actually disinvested in education of the nation in peacetime. And that opened a yawning gap such that pupils in private schools were now enjoying tuition from twice as many teachers per pupil as in state schools. I took with me 2 frontline experts, David Winkley, head of Grove Primary School in Handsworth, friend of the family, and Bernard Trafford, head of Wolverhampton Grammar School. One of the most disappointing moments of my ephemeral political life was when Andrew Adonis put his first question to us in the front parlour of Downing Street, and it was clear as day that employing more teachers for state schools, which I discussed with him face to face just 2 or 3 months earlier, was simply not on his agenda. I remember thinking, this is unreal. Is this the same person I'm talking to? The truth was that the T word, tax, and any policy that implied raising it was clearly a no-go area, despite Tony Blair's much trumpeted commitment to education, education, education. However, in the interests of political balance, as the BBC say, despite railing against Thatcher's cuts, I have one thing to thank her government for, albeit through gritted teeth. This is their new blood lectureship scheme, since it resulted in my appointment from October 1984 as assistant lecturer in modern demographic history here in the history faculty. Before moving to a teaching fellowship in St John's, I spent several years as a supernumerary fellow at Gonville and Caius College. This offered the opportunity for occasional chats over lunch or dinner with the late, great Joseph Needham, whose kindly, wise and principled manner reminded me strongly of my grandfather. This offered the opportunity for getting to know this amazing scholar. Oh yes, and while at Caius, I had a bet about time and space with the mischievous Stephen Hawking, who is depicted here in Graham Copacoga's. Graham is filming this at the back and worked for many years for us at History and Policy. It gave us fabulous work. This is his portrait of Stephen Hawking with the Newton's own copy of the Principia, which the University Library commissioned him to do. On Black Monday, 19th of October 1987, the London Stock Exchange crashed and the FTSE lost 11% of its value. There you are, that's Monday, that's the crash. That's Monday, then that's Tuesday down there. It lost a further 12% on the Tuesday. That evening, Tuesday evening, when the fellows retired as usual after dinner to the senior parlour to pass round claret and port, Stephen wanted to make a wager on how much further the FTSE would fall by the end of trading the next day, Wednesday, the 21st of October. The other fellows seemed to be reluctant to humour him. So after a while, young research fellow as I was, a new fellow as I was, I volunteered to take the bet. But to enter into the spirit of things, I announced that my wager was that it wouldn't fall at all, it would rally. Everybody seemed to agree that this was the drink talking. And Stephen was mortified because he thought it wasn't a serious bet. So I agreed that he would bet me it would fall by at least 8%, and you can see that recorded in the handwritten senior parlour's logbook. As the uptick on the graph shows, my flight of fantasy, with a bit of drink on board, had in fact caught the spirit of the market. I could have been a trader, which did indeed rally. And so Stephen lost the bet, and according to the rules, he had to buy a round of drinks next time we both dined, which was the 3rd of November, which you also see recorded there in the logbook. As a new lecturer in the history faculty, I was now teaching a range of subjects. One of these was health and mortality in Britain since 1750, which brought me into contact with the highly influential McEwen thesis. Professor Thomas McEwen's iconoclastic thesis was that medicine was something of a bystander in the story of the nation's health improvements. The most important reason why death rates had reduced since the Industrial Revolution, he argued, was rising real wages, purchasing better nutrition for the mass of the population. He had analysed cause of death data from 1838, the best in the world for that period, applying his great medical knowledge. I found that on looking critically at McEwen's own analysis of the epidemiological evidence, his sums and his logic did not really add up. They in fact showed, as I argued, that the causal key to falling death rates was not better nutrition per se. Of course, that is important over the long term, but it doesn't happen on its own, and it wasn't just delivered by real wages. The real causal key was the impact of public health measures, such as clean water and sewerage systems connected to every house, plus employing sanitary, housing and food inspectors and health visitors, once the political will was found to finance this in Britain's many industrial cities. After setting this thesis out in a working paper in 1986, I received a letter from Sir George Godber, previously mentioned. Would I like to meet him at his home in Almoners Avenue in Cambridge, where he lived in retirement? Now, this was quite something, as I knew he was rightly referred to in awe as Mr. NHS. He had worked at the heart of the Ministry of Health from 1939 and rose to become the nation's chief medical officer 1960 to 73. With the benefit of George Godber's advice over a nice lunch on various key issues, this then became my second peer-reviewed publication. Richard Smith, who is here, and Linda Bryder kindly gave it pride of place in April 1988 in the opening pages of the first issue of the first volume of the new journal they co-edited, Social History of Medicine. Just 2 months later, I received a letter from Sir Donald Aitchison, Sir George Godber's next but one successor, telling me, as Chief Medical Officer, telling me that he found it most interesting and persuasive, and that I'll be quoting you frequently. The article launched what has become known, I gather, as the Szreter-McEwen debate, and it has garnered over 1,000 citations. Most importantly, it has encouraged a lot of productive further research, including from colleagues in this room, such as Bernard Harris and Romola and Toki 8 and others, exploring the importance of public health policies at both local and national levels. Once again, this experience reinforced for me the message that academic historical work could have influence in the public policy world. Meanwhile, while all this was going on, I was continuing to develop research that I'd begun on my PhD on Britain's fertility decline. After labouring on this for 15 years, I produced in 1996 a book of 700 pages, not for the light-hearted, faint-hearted, could be for the light-hearted. Fertility, Class and Gender in Britain, 1860 to 1940. I was pleased to find that it elicited over 25 academic reviews, including from the likes of Charles Tilley and Stanley Engerman, very distinguished figures. In the London Review of Books, Michael Mason declared it to be a remarkable and very important book. And perhaps most pleasingly of all, Leonore Davidoff, the doyen of gender historians, wrote in the journal Gender and History that, quote, all historians, including those especially interested in gender, will be using this magisterial volume for years to come. A second joint-authored book, Changing Family Size, followed in 2001 with the analysis mostly undertaken by my great colleagues at the Cambridge Group, Ailey Garrett, Alice Reid and Kevin Shurer, who unfortunately Kevin can't be here. He's a little ill at the moment. Nothing too serious. My principal iconoclastic argument of fertility, class and gender was confirmed through this second volume's focus on detailed data for the 13 distinct locations you can see on the map. The thesis was that there were in fact multiple quite distinct fertility declines in scores of different communities, not a single event sweeping down from on high from social class 1 as depicted by the Registrar General's model. The main message of this summary diagram from fertility, class and gender, which is currently giving you a bit of a headache, is the complexity and diversity of reproductive change. Among the working classes, gender and labour markets were more significant than male skill levels in accounting for these patterns. For instance, a major reason why the 1 million highly paid coal miners, which you can see right down at the bottom with the highest fertility, was that men earned all the money in colliery communities. Women had no access to work, no bargaining power. And they were paid quite well as well, the men. Whereas among the 1 million lower paid, less skilled workers in, for instance, the cotton and wool textile factory towns, another big industry, in Lancashire, cotton, in West Yorkshire, wool, women had plentiful employment opportunities there in the factories. And this was where you found the lowest fertility in the working class. And so these occupations appear much higher up the diagram in rather smaller boxes, because these are all about male occupations, and half of the workforce is actually female. So the boxes really should be twice as big as they are, but I'm afraid they're a bit small. Somewhat surprisingly, not only was my 1996 book the first to propound the importance of structured gender relations in the field of demographic history, but the course of 8 lectures on the position of women and gender relations in British history, which I began to offer undergraduates each year from 1989 onwards, had been the first series of such lectures on the topic to be given by a staff member of the Cambridge History faculty. Of course, it had only been 41 years before this that Cambridge University had finally permitted women to take degrees. And still, in 1989, very few faculty lecturers were women. One attendee at those lectures became my first PhD student, Tessa Stone, who I'm very pleased is here today. Her research resulted in a prize-winning article in the journal Women's History Review on the WAF in World War II. Many other supervised PhDs followed, including those of Ben Griffin and Pedro Ramos Pinto, now my colleagues, and to whom I'm most grateful for organising with Keith Breckenridge the colloquium on my work earlier today, along with my wife, Hilary Cooper, who was also a big organiser. A further innovation in my own research on fertility decline and gender was to inquire about sexual relations and the negotiation of birth control among married couples during the first half of the 20th century, when family sizes were still falling so rapidly. In the mid-1990s, I realised that we could interview people now in their 70s and 80s or even early 90s. Sex and sexual relations are just a complete no-go black box area. I thought that the British public, famously tight-lipped about anything below the waist, might actually open up on the subject, having spent the previous decade in exposure therapy, thanks to Norman Fowler's Don't Die of Ignorance campaign to educate the public on HIV/AIDS transmission. So I submitted a grant proposal which was funded by the ESRC. Through Richard Smith, I learned that a bright PhD student at Oxford was already conducting interviews to ask about birth control and contraception. And so, while finishing up her PhD, Kate Fisher was able to join me in her hat as the project's researcher. In 2010, we published the pioneering book, Sex Before the Sexual Revolution, which was longlisted for the BBC Samuel Johnson Prize, now known as the Baillie Gifford. Before long, I found myself with Kate being interviewed on Woman's Hour by a highly appreciative Jenny Murray, with Simon Callow, another national treasure, writing such a positive review that it was the Guardian's Book of the Week. Interestingly, the book also got immediate positive reviews from Belle Mooney in the Daily Mail and Virginia Blackburn in the Daily Express. Perhaps you can please all the people all the time. I had long ago noticed, since 2010, the publication of this book, my own final frontier in the study of fertility has been to investigate another enormous, darker, and even more hidden subject. This is STIs, or venereal diseases, as they used to be called. I'd long ago noticed that hidden away in the report of the Royal Commission on Venereal Diseases of 1913 to 16, a table compiled by the same official responsible for the 1911 fertility census and all that wonderful data that I was able to use, Dr. T.H.C. Stevenson, had shown that syphilis rates might be running at a higher than average rate, not only amongst social class 5, which everybody expected, but also amongst the elite social class 1. Nobody had taken up this rather embarrassing finding. The sort of commission coughed and moved on, or explored its implications for involuntary sterility, which is primarily caused by the other, even more infectious STIs of gonorrhea and chlamydia. The study that he was presenting was mostly about syphilis. With my participation in the multidisciplinary Generation to Reproduction 5-year Welcome Project led by Nick Hopwood, who is here, in the History and Philosophy of Science department, I was able to convene another excitingly multidisciplinary conference in Cambridge in 2015, leading to another edited volume published in 2019, The Hidden Affliction. This brought together paleoarchaeology and classics, phylogenetics and early modern history, colonial Pacific and African history, the recounting of harrowing personal stories, along with the reconstruction of modern French, German and British science and policy. Very multidisciplinary, absolutely wonderfully exciting. We all began the conference believing gonorrhea was the oldest of these STIs, these historic STIs, stretching back to classical times, as the name suggests. Syphilis probably had appeared next in history with Columbus's return from the New World. There's debate about that, but on balance, it looks like that probably is the case. Chlamydia was, of course, the recent kid on the block. There was an enormous epidemic in the 70s and so on, just before AIDS. So that was our priors. We all left the conference after talking to each other and presenting our papers, realizing that when you put all our contributions together, the evidence indicated it was probably the other way round completely. It was chlamydia was almost certainly the most ancient affliction, not only of humans, but of many species. And the new kid on the block was probably gonorrhea. Not that new, probably 17th century, maybe even 16th. But Rebecca Fleming's great chapter exposed that none of the references to gonor this, gonor that in the classical text actually referred to the classic symptoms of gonorrhea. It always referred to something else. So when you put that together with the paleoarchaeology and the brand new reconstructive work of phylogenetics, those two actually both triangulated in suggesting that it was the 17th century or late 16th that was where things happened. Related research that I worked on in parallel for many years with Kevin Sienna resulted in 2020 article titled The Pox in Boswell's London. Unusually for an article published in the Economic History Review, it attracted a feature in the Times and ended up with me watching the Bridgerton series on TV. This only happened because the younger members of my family drew my attention to a blog by an Australian colleague inspired by this Times coverage. Her blog was called, "Did Everyone in Bridgerton Have Syphilis?" This had in turn attracted attention, her blog, as far as afield as the Indian popular press. Our chief finding had been that a young person in the 1770s living in London continuously to age 35 had a 20% chance of infection with the pox by the time they got to 35. That was a shockingly high figure, over twice the comparable figure I'd established for Chester in the 1770s. It also implied over half of the population of London had probably suffered a gonorrhea episode because it's a much more infectious disease. Indeed, Boswell himself documented affliction with a dose of the clap, gonorrhea, 17 times in his diary. Incidentally, I've been able to study Chester's syphilis rate thanks to a strange intergenerational collaboration between two Jonian scholars, myself and Dr. John Haygarth. He had attended St. John's in the early 1760s and had meticulously compiled the demographic and hospital data in Chester that I was gratefully able to analyse 250 years later. Coming back to the problems that have always informed my research, I've consistently been intrigued by the question of how societies summon the collective will to improve the lives of all citizens, including poor women and children, and also, crucially, how that will can become translated into measurably effective policy interventions. This led to a keen interest in the late 1990s in the emerging concept of social capital. I first learned about this from Robert Putnam's 1993 book, Making Democracy Work. Many of you will have heard of the other one, Bowling Alone. However, I couldn't find anybody in Cambridge who was interested in the idea and knew about it. Then I heard about a conference to take place at the rather obscure East Lansing campus of Michigan State University in April 1998. And I could see that Putnam was going to be there. So off I went. I found myself at dinner seated on the same table as Putnam himself, and I told him about the social capital desert in Cambridge. And he said, "Cambridge, UK, let me see." flicking through some kind of pocket Rolodex. I've got David Halpern, lecturer in social sciences, office in Jesus Lane, Cambridge. Well, I nearly fell off my chair. Here was the high priest of social capital providing a perfect demo of the concept. I could almost throw a stone from my study in St. John's to David Halpern's window in Jesus Lane. But in 1998, I didn't know of his existence, let alone that we shared an active interest in this new concept, until I went nearly 4,000 miles to Michigan. Even more importantly, this was before the internet, don't forget, even more importantly for my future research, on the same table I was sat next to a young Australian, Michael Woolcock. He was also here. He was just starting work as the first sociology PhD at the World Bank. Michael and I got on like a house on fire. Within a couple of years, the social capital was really rolling. Michael was here in Cambridge with his family as a visitor at St. Edmund's College, where we met with the young capabilities theorist Flavio Comim, who is also here. I had arranged a Beaufort visiting fellowship in St. John's for Robert Putnam, and we were running a weekly seminar on social capital featuring leading speakers such as Richard Wilkinson and Amartya Sen. An outcome of all this social capitalising was a co-edited book, another one with Michael, Biju Rao, and indeed the late Sir Christopher Bailey, History, Historians and Development Policy. There were also several articles, including one Michael and I co-authored, Health by Association, which is by far the most cited publication of mine. I looked a couple of days ago, there's over 3,500 citations of this article, the one at the top. And it's practically every day I get a message about it. In this article, we argued the need for an important modification to Putnam's conception of social capital. He had distinguished between bonding and bridging social capital, trusting relationships within civil society between people who saw themselves as socially or ethnically similar, the bonding, or who knew themselves to be rather different, the bridging. We argued this omitted the important issue of how to establish similarly respectful, trusting relationships between those who knew themselves to be interacting across unequal power gradients. The quality of this relationship was crucial to the interest we both shared, which was effective delivery by government or by development NGOs of empowering, not disempowering, interventionist measures to improve people's lives. We defined this as linking social capital. To exemplify this, we developed the episode I had studied of Joseph Chamberlain's gas and water municipal collectivism in 1870s Birmingham. This showed how important linking social capital was in the story of Chamberlain's transformation of Birmingham. With working class votes, which had only just happened in 1869, he put into practice the belief that the profits of natural monopolies like water should go to Birmingham and its people, not private shareholders. This was massive CEO on the board of a bank. He's saying these natural monopolies, gas and water, they need to be in public hands, not private shareholders' hands. We've completely forgotten this important lesson, and he knew what he was talking about. That account of Chamberlain was included in my 2005 book, Health and Wealth. On its cover, a satirical, as you can see, a satirical cartoon of Chamberlain as a fairy godmother, making Birmingham beautiful. He also made the city much healthier. This volume collected together a dozen of the main articles I'd published on public health history since the McEwen debate article of 1988, and I was honoured in 2009 to be the first non-American to receive the Arthur Visseltier Prize from the American Public Health Association for a body of distinguished scholarship in the history of public health. After 2005, my focus on the issues of social intervention also began to turn towards the extraordinary history of the British welfare state. It's widely believed that the welfare state is a mid-20th century creation. Most of you will associate it with the name Beveridge. This suggests to all of us that only in a modern, well-off society can we afford such a thing as a welfare state. Nonsense. Historical research of the last 40 years, in particular, shows us that a properly functioning universal social security system was first brought into being by statute, not just before the reign of Elizabeth II, but fully 350 years earlier than that, just before the reign of Elizabeth I had ended. This was the Poor Law Act of 1597-8. Paradoxically, the Poor Law has acquired a truly dreadful historical reputation. Most people will immediately find the words workhouse and Oliver Twist jumping into their mind if I say Poor Law. This is because in 1834, the old Poor Law of Elizabeth I had been in operation for so long was replaced with a new Poor Law, the main purpose of it which was deliberately to deter the poor from asking for assistance and to make them feel like criminals for doing so. And these workhouses attracted the wrath of many, including Charles Dickens. Consequently, it became entirely lost from our nation's memory and even from historians' understanding of the past that a previous, much more humane and charitable poor law had existed for almost 250 years. Much of that knowledge has now been recovered by my fellow historians. This is an example of history, the discipline changing history, what we think the past was. What we believe the past to have been. It potentially changes our understanding not only of the Poor Law, but also of the sources of economic change and prosperity. It is well known that Britain was the country where modern economic growth first occurred, symbolised by Boulton and Watt's rotary action steam engines manufactured from the late 18th century, of course, in Handsworth, in Birmingham. But what we now know is that an expanding universal welfare state preceded this. Could it be then that a welfare state system is not simply a latecomer, a burden on a productive market economy, but in fact a vital institution to enable it to come into being in the first place and to function and to grow? England's history shows that by providing universal social security to the elderly, this freed up the younger generation from responsibility for their parents, so they were able to migrate to wherever the better paid jobs were, and so put into practice Adam Smith's famous principle of the division of labour. This insight has informed several publications I have co-authored recently, using history to contribute to the world of public policy, notably an IPPR 2019 prize-winning essay, Incentivising an Ethical Economics, presenting ideas jointly developed with my wife, Hilary Cooper, and son, Ben Szreter, a Lancet article written with Anne-Louise Kinmont, who's here, and Mike Kelly, also here in 2020, and a book that I wrote with Hilary Cooper during lockdown, published in September 2021 as After the Virus. This showed how the neoliberalism of the last 40 years, supercharged by 10 years of misguided austerity initiated by George Osborne, left the poorest communities in our country cruelly vulnerable to the pandemic of COVID-19 when it struck in 2020. That same neoliberal package of beliefs in free markets, deregulation, worship of consumerism, now absolutely has to be fought back and replaced with a new respect for nature, for all peoples and species. My most important initiative in this college has been to connect together all the 25 or more fellows who are addressing this most critical policy problem from a multitude of disciplinary perspectives. This has resulted in the College Council setting in motion an activist climate crisis committee. As the past conferences I have convened and volumes I have edited attest, I strongly believe in the value of collaborative work, including bringing together insights from across disciplines to make progress with the most difficult and challenging problems, including those we face today on many fronts. To close, you'll be pleased to hear, I am most grateful, overrun a bit I'm afraid, I'm most grateful to all colleagues, past and present, and staff in the history faculty who have taught me and who I've worked with. After 40 years here, I'm afraid there are just too many to name. You know, but you all know who you are. Also, for the privileged stimulation of teaching undergraduates since 1980, in fact, and supervising masters and PhD students and mentoring postdocs since the early 90s. I'm additionally very grateful to everybody here at this happy place, St. John's College, for electing me to a fellowship in 1992 under the mastership of Robert Hind. Robert then became a great friend, as his room in college after retirement happened to be right next to mine. We had many animated chats for over 2 decades. The college has provided a model of supported collegial relationships where you cannot fail to have an interesting conversation and friendly exchange every time you go into lunch or into the porter's lodge with the porters. Indeed, on reflection, it seems that I may have been strangely fated to join the Fellowship of St. John's, since, as you have heard, I was born in Hull. This was also the birthplace of William Wilberforce. Fittingly, St. John's is also the college of the people's poet, William Wordsworth, born in the Lake District in Cockermouth. Why did they each, like their near contemporary, the Chester physician John Haygarth, and indeed William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who we saw earlier, why did they all come from the north of the country to St. John's? That's because the foundress of St. John's in 1511, Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII and grandmother of Henry VIII, insisted, along with her confessor John Fisher, that both this college and her other foundation, Christ's College, should operate a strict access policy in today's terminology. The foundation statutes specify that fully 1/2 of the fellows and 1/2 of the students, scholars as they were called then, were to be drawn from the 9 northernmost counties, at that time clearly the poorest part of England. I have shown in some research for the college's alumni magazine, The Eagle, that this statute was honoured for centuries. You can analyse the registry, and they were honouring it. The current master, Heather Hancock, our first female master since the college was founded and herself a northerner, is certainly doing her best to revive this again today. As always, we have much to learn from recovering a true knowledge of the past. I've been able to choose throughout my career what I want to work on, and these two institutions, the History Faculty and the College, have allowed me to achieve a work-life balance which has enabled me to be a full part of my children's and my wider family's lives, something very important to me. And for all of us. I can only hope the university and the colleges can continue to maintain this for our younger colleagues in these difficult times. When Hilary and I decided in 2006 to have a family portrait, I was delighted to commission Louise Riley-Smith, whose husband, Jonathan, had so entertained me 30 years before with his Python-esque lectures on the Crusades. Here you see on the left the young Iridium with their treasured harp, the family's polyglot linguist, and like my sister Anya, a talented musician. Next, Ben, the keen footballer, who unfortunately for Cambridge was the penalty-saving goalkeeper who won the 2015 varsity match for Oxford here at the Abbey Stadium. Also a West Brom fan, of course. He is currently bringing his team-leading and hopefully winning ways to labour together. And on the right is our youngest, Zach, with his school children's Shakespeare open on his lap. He loves performing and singing on stage, which comes in rather handy as a newly minted maths and physics teacher. Oh, and who's that lady with the glass of wine? I leave you with my tribute to the family's MVP. And if you don't know what that is, ask somebody who knows about football. Hilary has shared and made possible our family life together, while also pursuing her own career in public policy. She has accompanied and constructively and critically supported this scholar on his journey. She was there in the archive in Peru, and yes, she was the female travelling companion lined up against a wall with me in a hotel in Kampala in 1981. Now, you've all been so patient. Let's go for a drink downstairs. Thank you.